We begin now at the top of Daf Beis and Aleph and Meseches Moed Kattan. This is Moed Kattan Daf 2a. The Mishnah says, Mashkin beis hashalochin b'moed uveshvius. You're allowed to irrigate a field that requires irrigation on Chol Moed and also during the Shemitah year. Rashi over here says, Mashkin beis hashalochin b'moed. Sadashi omedes bahar. We're talking here about a field that's on a mountain or on an incline. V'tzarach la'ashkos hatamid. You have to always irrigate such a field. So Mashkin osa afilu b'chol Moed. You're allowed to irrigate it even on Chol Moed. Because that represents a great loss of money if he doesn't irrigate it. It says in Meseches Chagiga that when you have something where there's a loss of money involved, the Chacham allow you to do that kind of work on Chol Moed. Like it says in the pasuk, meaning even the days of Chol Moed, we learn from the pasuk, it's a problem to do malacha. I might think all malacha is prohibited on Chol Moed. It says Hashvi, the seventh day, that's a real yontiv, you can't do any malacha. But on Chol Moed, some malacha is okay. The pasuk gives it over to the Chachamim to determine what kind of work is permitted and what kind is not permitted. So the rule is as follows. If you have a malacha where it's going to be a loss of money, if you don't do that malacha, for example, if you have to irrigate a beis hashlachin, that's a field that requires irrigation, that the Chachamim allow. Uvashvius, it also says you're allowed to do this irrigation on the Shemitah year. Mefarish b'Gemara, this will be explained in the Gemara. And the Mishnah continues when we're talking about irrigating this field, bein mimayon sheyatza b'tchila, whether you're using the water from a spring that has just emerged, bein mimayon shelo yatza b'tchila, or whether it's a spring that has not just emerged, it's always been around. Rashi over here explains, mimayon sheyatza b'tchila, the achshav maschil in voa. It means it just emerged. Shadayin lo hechzika darka. The point is that such a spring, it's not clear. The path is not steady yet. It's not a stable spring. Possible that the walls will collapse. Something else might happen. So you're allowed to use that. Or you could use a spring which didn't just emerge. It means it's a spring that's been flowing for a very long time. That's a more stable spring. It doesn't make a difference. The Mishnah is saying it makes no difference. In either case, you can use either kind of water to irrigate such a field. However, you're not allowed to irrigate from the Mei Geshamim, which is the rain, and not from the Mei Kilon. And Rashi over here, the reason is even though there's a loss of money involved, but to use Mei Geshamim is too much of a tircha. You can't do too much of a tircha on Chol Moed, as will be explained in the Gemara. And with regards to Mei Kilon, that also involves a tircha. That involves a situation where you're using a lever to draw water that's deep in a well. That also is going to be a problem. And the Mishnah continues, Vein osin ugios legefanim. You're not allowed to make ditches for gefanim, for the vines. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Ein osin eso'ama b'tchila b'moed. You're not allowed to create a water channel from scratch on Chol Moed. In other words, you can't create a new water channel on Chol Moed. Uva shvius, and in the Shemitah year as well, that's a problem. But the Chachamim say, osin eso'ama b'tchila b'shvius. You are allowed to make a water channel on the Shemitah year. You're also allowed to fix up those that are ruined. Let's say you have a situation of a ruined water channel, you can fix it on Chol Moed. And the Mishnah continues, you're allowed to fix the water cisterns in Rosh Hashanah. You can clean them out. Let's say they have dirt in them. You're also allowed to fix the paths and the streets and the mikvahs. You're allowed to do anything that is needed for the public. You're also allowed to mark the grave sites on Chol Moed. And you're also allowed to go out in terms of kilayim to inspect and make sure kilayim is not growing anywhere. And if it is growing, you can rectify the problem. And the Gemara says, If the Mishnah already said that you're allowed to irrigate this field, this is talking about a field that requires irrigation. If the Mishnah said you're allowed to irrigate this field from a spring that just began to flow, which may actually collapse, mashkin, yet you're allowed to use that water for irrigation. So if you have a spring that's already established, that's stable, it's not going to fall apart. Do you even need to say it? Of course you can use such a mayan. Why does the Mishnah say both cases? Once you just say the case of sheyatza b'tchila, of course a regular mayan is going to be okay. Rashi over here says, Like we said, in such a situation where it's a new spring, the land that's around it, it's not stable. So of course, mashkin b'chol shel moed, if you're allowed to use that on chol moed and irrigate, we're not afraid it's going to collapse and then it's going to be more of a tircha. So mayin shelo yatsa b'tchila shekvar hechzik darko, if you have a stable spring, miboy, you need to say that the mashkin mimenu b'chol shel moed. Of course, you can use it on chol moed. So the question is, why do you have to list both cases in the Mishnah? So the Gemara says, Amri, they said the following answer: Itzrich, it's needed. Itana mayin sheyatsa b'tchila. If we only said the case of an unstable spring that just began to emerge, so havamina, so I might have thought as follows: Hachahu de beis hashalchinin beis habal lo. In a situation where it's not stable, that's where you can irrigate a field that requires irrigation. But a beis habal is a field that's in the lower areas, in the lowlands. You don't really need to irrigate it. So that's where we say it's no good with a beis habal. Mishum dasil pule, because you have the added issue over here that it's not stable. But if you have a stable spring, it's not going to fall apart. So so I would think you can irrigate anything with that, not just a beis hashlachin, even a beis habal, even a field that doesn't really require irrigation. Maybe you can use such a spring to irrigate it. So kamash malon. So that's what the Mishnah is teaching us. Loshna mayin sheyatsa b'tchila, veloshna mayin shelo yatsa b'tchila. Doesn't matter how stable the spring is. The halacha is beis hashlachin in, beis habal lo. If it's a field that requires irrigation, it's okay. If it's a beis habal, it's going to be a problem. Rashi over here says beis habal sadashu be'emek. Again, it's like a field that's in the valley. Ve'en tzarich lashkos. It doesn't really need irrigation. Ve'en behefsid, not a loss of money. Ve'en mashkos, if you don't irrigate it. Kamash mulan masnisin the tani bein mayin shelo yatsa b'tchila beis hashlachin in beis habal afilu mimayin shelo yatsa b'tchila lo. Again, the permission is only by beis hashlachin. It's not allowed by a beis habal. And the Gemara continues, Umay mashma dahai beis hashlachin lishna de tzachosahi. How do we know that the language of beis hashlachin, how do we know that's a language of tzachosa, meaning it's a language of thirst, as if this is a field that needs irrigation? T'chsiv, like the pasuk says, V'ata ayef v'yokeya, you were tired, you were weary. Umitargamin, and if you look at the targum on that pasuk, what does it say? V'at mishalhe v'loi, uses the word mishalhe, which means to say this exact idea that you were thirsty, you're tired, you're worn out. And so therefore, again, mishalhe and beis hashlachin, similar words, it means it's a field that requires irrigation, it's thirsty. And the Gemara says, Umay mashma dahai beis habal demiyas aftahi. How do I know that the language of beis habal is a language that it's a settled piece of land? It's a land that doesn't need irrigation. T'chsiv, like the pasuk says, ki yival bocher besula. It says that a bocher is going to take a young lady. So mitargamina, and so we translate that pasuk, and that's ki yival, like the language of Baal. How do we translate it? Arekama demitos of ulam in besulta. Yes, yavyun begavach benach. It says that the way that a young man settles with a young woman, the mitosav, that's a settled area. That's the idea, that a beis habal is a settled piece of land. So too, that's how your sons are going to settle. Mantana dipseida in harvachalo. So now the Gemara asks as follows: who's the author of our Mishnah that says that when it's a loss of money, that's okay on chol hamoed, but if it's for profit, it's a problem on chol hamoed? Ve'afilu b'makom pseida. And then our Mishnah goes further and says, even in a situation where there's a loss of money, mitrachnami lo tarchin, and you can't do too much tircha. Rashi over here says, Man tana de masnisin de pseida shari lemitrach bo b'chol shel moed kagon beis hashlachin. So first our Mishnah said if there's a loss of money, it's okay. And then harvachalo could go into beis habal d'asur lashkosa. When it comes to beis habal, no loss of money, it's asur. Me'achar shein bo hefsed, there's no loss. Shein tzarach lashkosa lo laharvacha demilsa l'shavya afilu afle charfe. In other words, if you're just doing it for profit purposes, so that's not allowed. And afilu b'makom pseida mitrach lo tarchin. And our Mishnah went further and said even in a loss of money, you can't do it if it's too much of a bother. The katani masnisin avalomi megashamim. The Mishnah says you can't use rainwater mishum deis bei tircha, because that's already tircha. So who's the Tana of our Mishnah that has these 2 points? So the Gemara answers, Amar Ravuna. Ravuna says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Tana of our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Omer, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Moshchen es hamayim me'ilon l'ilon. Let's say you have a channel of water. You can draw that water from one tree to another tree. Uvilvan shelo yishkes hasadakula. As long as you don't do the entire field. And Rashi over here says, Moshchen hamayim me'ilon l'ilon b'cholo shel moed. And yesh mayim tachas ilon echad. Let's say in a chol moed you have a little water by one tree. Osin derech katan me'ilon l'ilon. You can dig so that the water will go from one tree to the other. Kadei sheyimshach hamayim me'ilon zel l'ilon acher. So that again the water will go from one tree to the other. Lo yashkes hasadakula. But don't do the whole field. Beis habal kamayri deharvachahi. We're talking here in a sada beis habal. It's really for profit. It's not going to be a loss of money. Alma deharvacha demilsa aser belazar. You see that if it's a situation of profit, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says it's a problem. That's what it means. Uvilvan shelo yashkes hasadakula, harvacha is a problem. So the Gemara says, Amor de Shamat Leila Rabbi Eliezer Harvacha Delo. We understand that Rabbi Eliezer is clearly saying here Harvacha profit is a problem. But Tircha b'makom seida mishamat le. But we don't see anything that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov has not mentioned anything about a situation where it's a tircha in a situation of a loss of money that's also prohibited. We only see one of the two points in our Mishnah. And so the Gemara says, Elo Amar Papa, rather Papa says, Hom Mani Rabbi Yehuda. Who's the author of our Mishnah? The author of our Mishnah is actually Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Mayan Hayotze B'tchila, if you have a spring that just emerged, Mashkin Mimenu Afilu Sada Beis Habal, Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you can use that to irrigate even a Sada Beis Habal, which is a field that doesn't really require irrigation. That's what Rabbi Meir says. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein Mashkin El Sada Beis Hashlachin Shecharva. You're only allowed to use it to irrigate a field that requires irrigation if it dried up. That will be explained in the Gemara. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Lo kach velo kach. You can't do this or that. This also will be explained in the Gemara. And Yeser al Kain Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda goes even further than this and says, Lo yifna adam amas hamayim v'yashka leginaso u'lechorvaso b'chol shel moed. A person shouldn't take an amas hamayim, a channel of water, and guide it and extend it in order to use it to irrigate his garden or his chorva or his run on chol moed. So the Gemara now says, My chorva. What does it mean over here when Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to use it to irrigate a sada beis hashlachin, which is a field that requires irrigation, if it dried out? What do you mean it dried out? If you mean to say that it actually completely dried out, so lamali damashkila, what's even the point of irrigating it? So Amar Abaye says shecharva mimayin zeh v'yotzala mayin acher. What happened was one spring of water that was irrigating it that dried out, but there's another spring that you can use, and that's what you're going to use. Rashi over here says, meaning it became totally dried out. It's like a pit. Lamali lamashke lahi. What's the point? You'll never be able to fix such a situation. So the Gemara says, no. What he meant to say, again, what Rabbi Yehuda meant to say was it dried up one spring, but there's another spring. In other words, there was a spring that it normally took from. Since it's accustomed to being irrigated, if you don't irrigate it, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a great loss of money. Still, Rabbi Yehuda says, you're only allowed to use it from a spring which is not a tircha. But if you're going to use rainwater, or if you're going to use the lever to draw the water, the tirchu, that's already too much of a burden. Lo shari, it's not permitted. Afilu lebeis hashlachin, even for beis hashlachin. So you already see in Rashi within Rabbi Yehuda, he says both points. It has to be a loss of money, and even if it's a situation of a loss of money, it can't be too much of a tircha. Now, furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda in this brisa says you can't take that channel of water and extend it to your gina or chorba. Alma de lo shari Rabbi Yehuda tircha yasera. You see from that as well that Rabbi Yehuda does not allow tircha yasera. Alma masnis and Rabbi Yehuda. You see that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. Dehar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Now, in terms of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says lo kach v'lo kach, what does he say? Lo shna charav ma'inam yimayin sheyotzla b'tchila. He says it doesn't make any difference if it dried up. V'lo shna lo charav, it doesn't matter if it didn't dry up. Tarvayu aser. He's even more strict. He goes beyond Rabbi Yehuda and says it's going to be a problem, even though it represents a loss of money. It's still going to be a problem, as the Gemara now explains. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says lo kach v'lo kach. What does that mean? Lo shna charav ma'ina, it doesn't matter if it dried out. V'lo shna lo charav ma'ina, it doesn't matter if it didn't dry out. Mayan sheyotza b'tchila lo. You're never allowed to use a spring that just emerged. Rabbi Yehuda allows you to use that spring that just emerged. That's okay, because it's not too much of a tircha. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah does not allow that. And the Gemara says, umimai, how do you know necessarily that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda? Dilma adkan lo kama Rabbi Yehuda beis hashlachin in beis habal lo. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda only said that a beis hashlachin you're allowed to irrigate in a beis habal you're not. Elamayan sheyotza b'tchila. Only when we're talking about a spring that just emerged. And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Beis Amud Beis.